The timing will probably not work out, and we've had a history of miscarriage, so we're really grateful for the children we have.
Yeah, no, I gathered that from your book. And anyway, let me introduce you properly here.
All right.
Um, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is, do you say Leah or Leah?
Leah.
Yeah, okay, not to be confused with the Star Wars.
Exactly.
Okay, and my guest is Leah Libresco Sargeant, and Leah is a writer and speaker whose work covers religion, culture, statistics, and family policy. She runs the Substack community, quote, Other Feminisms. She is the author of a book that I just have not read because we're talking about one I have called Building the Benedict Option and Arriving at Amen, as well as the book we are talking about today, The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto, which I just finished reading on Kindle and we'll be talking about. I have a lot of notes on, and I really enjoyed the book. So I'm asking you for In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on YouTube to please subscribe right now live and when you watch it, and also with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, where this will be going. And to my Substack, it has to be said, commentary page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And you can follow my new project at thegospelofzip.com, which is both a book that you can buy on Amazon in Kindle and as a hard copy, or you can watch it for free on YouTube, where I recorded all 8 hours and put the book up there so it's yours if you just want to tune in. You can also support our work and this podcast by making a tax-deductible donation at georgebailey.org. Okay, so let me just say, I'm going to pull up your book and talk about it in a minute. I forget where I first saw you or read you, but I saw you recently with Ross Douthat on his podcast, and you shared the platform with another guest he had, and you were talking there, and I really liked what you were saying, and I thought that was just terrific, and I thought he asked you really good questions. I enjoy watching what he does and his guests. But what I've done is something a little unusual for a host, and that is I pieced together bits out of your book not in the order in which you wrote them, but that I feel will draw people into the things I want to discuss. So if you will forgive me for
Sure.
juxtaposing some things that are not they are the way you wrote them, but they're not in the order in which you wrote them. So I'm going to do a little reading first, and then I'm going to start asking you some things. But I just want to tell people that I think this book is phenomenally interesting. And, you had me at the word dependence, when I was watching you with Ross Douthat and also just in reading your book. So, my Jeannie and I have been together 56 years. I'm 73 years old. Literally in and while I was reading your book this morning, what I was doing is fixing 3 school lunches for my teenage grandchildren who live nearby, who, as a Christmas present that my wife gave to them, she said, Ba, they call me Ba instead of grandfather,
Hmm.
will cook school lunches for you 2 times a week. So that was, she gave me uh, because, I've done so much childcare for them along with Jeannie that I'm cooking for them, and they were thrilled. So I was cooking their school lunch while reading your book. So I think those things went together very well. And that's what I was doing today. So I'm going to open with this, and then, like I said, it's out of context. The task ahead of us is finding ways to extend and restore that network of giving and receiving. Even if there were a sudden fertility boom, many of us who are already alive will age, decline, and die with thinner network of family and friends than those who came before us. And here's another section. Even in calmer, safer circumstances, openness to need instills a habit of resistance. Being marked by another's dependence makes it hard to go along with a culture that values the frictionless and the interchangeable. And another section. Even as technology and culture change, women are uniquely unable to deny that others depend on us. We can't live fully within the lie of autonomy. Unfortunately, the culture around us persists in denying the reality of our relationship of mutual dependence. And another section. When the world is the wrong shape for women, women will look for a range of techniques to solve or sidestep their womanhood. Our culture is sometimes male normed, but frequently the norm women are trying to match is simply an inhuman norm, one that neither men nor women can comfortably inhabit. And another section, a woman's fertility and biology generate friction in a world that demands smooth stability. When she becomes aware of the way she is made differently than the imaginary ideal woman, she must choose whether to conform or find an exit. And I guess your book is sort of that exit. So, anyway, I chose those passages because to me, they kind of embody the essence of what your book is talking about. So, let me ask you how you came to write this book. And you talk about that a little in the book and how you zeroed in on that. And I know in the book, I'm not going to mention anything personal that's not in the book, but things that are in the book, I'm going to talk about. Um, you know, you're a professional woman, you're an academic, you're a writer, but you've also had a number of miscarriages, you have a number of children, you have a husband that you write about. You're very involved in that relationship, and that's the background of the book. But then why did you write this book in particular? As in, what need do you feel this piece of nonfiction literature fills that wasn't being addressed by other writers, other women writers, whomever?
Thank you so much for having me on. I'd say a lot of what I was trying to do in this book that I thought hadn't been done yet was to join up some fragmented parts of the conversation about what it means to be a woman and what it means to be just to women.
Yeah,
You know, I titled the book A Feminist Manifesto, though I think it's obvious not all mainstream feminists would identify strongly with
yeah.
it. But the place that I think brings us together is this concern for what does it mean to acknowledge men and women as different without
Mm,
ultimately treating one or the other as defective or lesser? I think
yeah.
often when we frame our arguments for the equality of women through presumed exchangeability between women and men, then any difference we happen to notice seems like it's a problem that has to be solved or a
Mm.
defect in women. And that's kind of one of the animating themes of the book, where I'm joining up these different parts of what it means to be a woman that can be viewed as a fault in women, and looking at how we receive women as they are.
Yeah, no, I really love that. Actually, I'm not gonna, I can't wave your book around. I'm gonna ask you to wave yours around because I read mine on Kindle, and Ernie, my producer, Ernie Gregg, is gonna snag me a copy. A book that I have interviewed the other author, another author on, is Kat Bohannon's book called Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. It's a very good book. And she um, really helped me focus on the same issue you're looking at from the science point of view. And she actually begins her book with something that sounds like it's taken from your book, although she wrote hers first, which was, you know, the whole idea of you just take when you're prescribed medicine that's been tested on men only, and you're a woman, and so basically you're a few pounds lighter, and they simply subscribe a little less, but it's not actually designed for women because the women have not been studied. I was very interested that Kat begins her book with that, saying, well, maybe it's time to actually study women's evolution as something uniquely different. They're just not a sort of a different version of men. And her book is very good about that. So I don't know if you know about Kat Bohannon's book or not, but you and she overlap the material. So I kind of felt that having read Kat's book prepared me to read yours in an odd kind of a way because you know you're dealing with the same subject. One thing that you bring up in your book is the experience of being a teenage female and basically you know health class and this kind of thing. The kind of behavior that boys exhibit towards girls who develop breasts or having periods. So without, I've got that section noted. Let's start there in terms of your own childhood experience of discovering you are a female and how this is going to play out. So let's go first to your teen experience of that.
Yeah, I think for many women, this experience of diverging in this stronger way from your male peers
Mm.
is presented as though it's kind of a problem, a bad thing happening to you. In my school, they separated the boys and girls for their puberty talk, so I don't know exactly what the boys heard, but for
Yeah,
girls, it's all about your body is changing, it's creating new issues for you to manage.
yeah,
And some of those issues are kind of directly related to menstruation, but I think for many women, and me among them, it creates a new problem of your changing body attracting
mm,
unwanted male attention,
yeah,
where you have a new problem to manage, and it's that the fact of your being a woman, of visibly being a woman, leads to harassment.
yeah,
And one thing I talk about in the book is that, I think nowadays you kind of see where women look for an exit. Is there a way I can avoid this part of being a
yeah,
woman? And for some women, that exit has come through anorexia, a way
Yeah,
of waging war against the body. And I
yeah.
think today it increasingly comes through, disidentification with being a woman at all. I talk about one natal girl who identifies strongly as non-binary because she feels like that places her outside of the sex that men have access to. And it's a
Mm,
way of exiting a way of being a woman she doesn't want to be subject to.
mm. Yeah, no, I think there's, and I love what you write about in terms of young women. Again, with 5 grandchildren, I'm sort of into the parenting stage of life again. Two of them are adults, and the others are teenagers in high school near me. So I'm kind of doing a second round of addressing this as a father, now a grandfather. But, I just thought that everything you said about that completely reflected, I won't say my experience as a young female because I haven't been one, but my experience as the loving father and grandfather of watching females go through this and then trying to deal with what they confront in school and so forth. Let me read you a little more from the book that kind of gets us back into the subject again. The tools women are offered can be helpful on the margin, but they often are designed less to fit our lives than to help us fit into an imaginary life. So let's talk about that imaginary life. What is the imaginary life? I know because I read the rest of the book, but I'd like you to explain it.
I think there's a lot of kind of tools or shifts or accommodations women are offered to solve the problem of being women. And that can be everything from physical adjustments. I draw a lot on the work of Caroline Criado Perez, who's written about gender disparities and writes about the way that female surgeons mentor new female surgeons about how to
Sure.
hold equipment in non-standard ways because it's not well proportioned to their hands. But I think in a bigger way than that, kind of the bigger imaginary life that people feel like they're trying to live up to is the ideal of autonomy.
Mm,
That a full human life is one where all the connections in your life are voluntary. You're free to walk away. You're free to take a pause. They can't demand things of you that you don't consent to give.
mm,
And obviously, pregnancy is a big, obvious exception to that. When I'm pregnant, even when I'm excited about being pregnant, I'm not moment by moment saying, yes, baby, you may have this much of the calcium in my bones, which is the amount I can spare. And, oh, that's too much, right? I
yeah.
don't have control in that way. But I think, especially through the lens of pregnancy, this really bucks hard against the idea that life is best when it's chosen and controlled. But a
Mm.
lot more of our life follows this pattern of unchosen connections or connections that can grow and change past what we originally signed up for than we imagine.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point because it does not apply just to women and their story. It applies to, for instance, any man that loves his sons and doesn't want them fatherless when he hits a patch in his marriage where he might walk away. And he says, no, I'm sticking around for their sake. I'm not an autonomous being.
Hmm.
I have an obligation. It's not even a question of moral duty. It's driven by love. Um, and I love that about your book, by the way, because I think that it is delusional to think that anyone is autonomous. It's just that men have an easier time pretending that women, when they find themselves pregnant. You, I'm going to go back to the book. You say our culture offers other ways to annihilate the female body in order to opt out of the way women are treated. Part of the sleight of hand relies on de-essentializing womanhood. The more the difference between men and women can be described as social, not biological, the easier it appears for women to, quote, catch up. Women are marked as different by customs, not by our bodies, and thus we can aspire to equivalency without having to lose anything of ourselves. Again, if you want to dive into that a little bit and explain what you're talking about, and I would just say you give a physical example in a different area about the way car seats and airbags are designed by people who are basically saying, women are just smaller versions of men. And anyway, it's their problem. They're sitting too close to the steering wheel, which of course you have to do because you're smaller. Oh, and by the way, they aren't designed for old people either because their bones are brittle. We're designing car seats and airbags for normal people, i.e., 30-year-old men, basically. So, this is a theme that runs through your book, but if you just want to address the point I brought up first.
Yeah, I think part of what's going on here is that there's a lot of political nervousness about talking about the differences between men and women. Again, especially if you're kind of premising political equality on that interchangeability, which is
Yeah,
why people are tempted to reduce it to mostly a social thing. Well, your parents gave you dolls or trucks, and that's what's going on, but there's
sure.
nothing at the heart of you that's different, or there's nothing meaningful physical that's different. Women are basically tiny men, which is how our car manufacturers treat women
Yeah.
Until 2027, when for the first time there will be a female proportion dummy used in crash texts.
Yeah. Not just a smaller version of the male dummy.
Exactly. But as you said, you saw me on Ross Douthat's podcast, and I was having a conversation about whether women are a detriment to the workplace, which is the position of my interlocutor. And,
Yeah.
a lot of her argument started with men and women are different, so which one is better? And I think
Yeah.
that's what pushes people to consider this as mainly a purely social difference,
Yeah.
because once you admit there might be ineradicable differences, it does open you up to having to actually defend, is there a problem here? If I still believe the sexes are equal in dignity and equal politically, well, now I've got to make some level of positive case for it rather than, well, the
Mm.
differences are all trivial, so only bigotry could provoke people to make a distinction legally.
Yeah, you go back and start again with middle school. My middle school health class had covered, speaking of differences here, women's bodies in puberty as a new set of problems to be solved. Tampons and pads for blood, deodorant for smell, ibuprofen for pain, bras for new unwieldy weight, and razors and wax for hair. There was nothing about growing into a woman's body that was an uncomplicated good. Everything was a question of how best to manage the change and make sure it didn't inconvenience us or anyone else. Building an artificial woman is another section. And you say outside the classroom, there have always been scientists with a bigger dream of solving the problem of women's bodies in a more definitive way. Every few years, there's a little surge of news stories that tell us that artificial wombs and women's and final liberation are now just 5 to 10 years away. The wombs are offered as a kind of a reproductive justice. And I would just say that, this is an area I've done a lot of reading in. And it's interesting to me that some of the tech bros, like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, are very much part of this discussion these days. And in the case of, Elon, he's off there having babies with multiple women. Through surrogacy programs with donating sperm, then having it genetically tested to make sure it's the right kind of baby. There's a Chinese billionaire who, according to his own count, has now had 100 sons with American surrogate mothers, who are performing surrogacy for him to raise this tribe of sons. He doesn't want any women, so presumably they're discarding all the female
Yes.
embryos. So what you're talking about, the artificial womb, okay, they can say we're on the cusp of that, but what we're already in the midst of is basically a whole host of people who are in very, positions of incredible power who seem to be looking at women in a way that, kind of imitates the kind of Genghis Khan approach to females. You just have sex and make babies, except now they're designer babies. So I know this isn't specific to your book, but that section made me think of this, and brings the issue up that what has been talked about in a kind of a science fiction fantasy realm, or kind of in apocalyptic terms with movies like Gattaca, seem very much cuspish when it comes to kind of the tech bros that increasingly write the algorithms that herd us all into various groups of people online and form our thinking. This isn't specifically about your book, but there's no way not to go there in this context. So what are your thoughts on this? And I'm not fishing for anything in particular. I'm just really curious about what you think about, because I know you must be thinking about
I
this.
think it's profoundly disturbing. And I think part of what it speaks to is the idea that children are either a consumer good that you should be able to buy access to on the market. And since they're a consumer good, you should have the options for all the customizations or prioritizations the way that you would add on heated seats to a car. So you
Yeah,
see that taking hold in some of the eugenic embryo screening or surrogacy agencies where they're saying, well, of course, like we can make this work however you want to.
yeah,
But I think even for people who aren't engaging in that obviously venal way, there's a real push across the culture to think about parents as the authors of their children, who have a lot of say in who their children are and who are obliged as good parents to make prudent choices about, well, should we have another boy or another girl? Should we check for intelligence? Aren't you happier being intelligent or tall or whatever the matter may be?
mhm,
Versus thinking of parents as stewards of a gift, of
yeah,
welcoming someone they don't fully know or understand, who may surprise them in ways both good and, as they'd understand it, bad.
yeah,
But that they're fundamentally taking a receptive posture towards their children rather than a position of ownership or authorship.
yeah. And I think, the overarching theme of your book, aside from these specifics, is the idea that we are all dependent, we're not autonomous. And of course, from my perspective as being a bit older than you, if I may just throw this in, this matches what I have discovered to actually be true about life. In other words, autonomy is a true illusion. And the worst parts of my life that I'm least happy with and most ashamed of as I look back was always based on this idea of autonomy. And the best parts of my life are where I look back and I say, that was a time when I took care of somebody. I was reading the section in your book about the miscarriages and having babies and bleeding and all this other stuff. And I was reminded of something I wrote about in my book, The Gospel of Zip, which is an account of accompanying Jeannie, who bled heavily off and on for a year before she had a
Mm.
hysterectomy at Mayo Clinic, on one of our many visits to the hospital in the middle of the night when, is she going to, where's this going to end and how this is going to end, finding ourselves in a cubicle that was reserved for women's problems. And what I was surrounded with is little plastic bags and a Polaroid camera marked "Do not remove from rape room," because it
Mm.
was a room used to collect evidence of women who had been raped. And that's where we were stuck while the on-call gynecologist who would show up at 2 a.m.
Ah.
showed up. So from a male perspective, all I can say is that to have loved a woman for 56 years, that I got pregnant when we were 17 and 18 and have been together ever since, and then taking care of these female grandchildren, this sort of second bite at this apple.
Mhm.
Um, I just want to say I really related to your book and the love with which you write about, the experience of being a woman. This is something you accept and love, but at the same time, talk about the problems. I know that's sort of not specific to the book, but I want to go into a section, something that is sort of related to what you said, but it also relates to my life. And I'm not, this is not a gotcha question, and I'm not fishing for anything. But in my youth, I was the sidekick, a nepotistic sidekick to my father, Francis Schaeffer, who was very big in forming the beginnings of the evangelical wing of the anti-abortion, pro-life movement. And our good family friend, Dr. C. Everett Koop, who then became Ronald Reagan Surgeon General, and my dad made a film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which was basically, at least according to my friend Archbishop Fulton Sheen of New York, who said, "Thank God the cavalry have arrived," when I went and met with him privately when I was in my mid-20s as dad's producer and director on this series. The cavalry being, here come the evangelicals to help with our pro-life movement. Fast forward to the present era, the kind of people that we wound up empowering, and this is not about the issue of abortion, that's a separate question, we can talk about that, but politically turned out to be Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and the other billionaires who are sucking up to Donald Trump, as well as some of the more far right people at the Heritage Foundation, some of whom have now forced the ouster, or people who've resigned who, because of anti-Semitism and other things. And so one of the things I've learned in my life the hard way is the law of unforeseen consequences. And I not only respect the Roman Catholicism that undergirds your book, and say um, other books of other authors we've interviewed on this program, but I'm asking you, just as someone who's at a younger part of your life and writing, if you already see a pattern in which some of the unintended consequences of things we're involved with now are going to play out in this sort of Elon Muskian futuristic way that are just horrifying. So I'll give you one example. I noticed that JD Vance went down and spoke at a pro-life conference. Great. But I also noticed that the billionaires like Peter Thiel, who are financing them, are running the new eugenics program, which is exactly what my father and Coop predicted would happen if abortion remained legal. So how does one square that circle when, um, we see things playing out that were kind of the future prophetic worst case scenario by the original pro-life movement, now, in the Trump administration, as JD Vance basically, goes with this billionaire view of human life that are against there, that you've been talking about. And it's a real problem to me. I don't have a conclusion. I don't have any, I'm not, I can't draw a conclusion, but there's no way that someone like you, who's writing about abortion and babies and life and motherhood and care, can't see that the unintended consequence of where we went with pro-life crusade, winding up with Donald Trump of all people, and the people he's now empowering, or JD Vance is empowering, this is not what Fulton Sheen and my dad and Dr. Koop had in mind. And I'm just curious if you have any uh, view of that, because it,
Well, I'll give one unambiguous bit of good news and then where I think we have the leverage to do better, which is that it sounds like Fulton Sheen is going to be beatified this year. So at least we
okay,
have
well,
his
good. Then I know a
intercession.
saint who
So there's
actually
that,
prayed with me.
right? Yes, so that's good news. Now, what does that mean for the rest of us still here
Hey,
on
just give
Earth?
me that detail. Give me that information in a little more detail. Tell me about that, because, and then we'll get back to my
So
question.
I just know what I've read in The Pillar so far, which is my favorite Catholic news source. But
Yeah,
they say that a date is being set for this year for his beatification was put on hold while they did last inquiries into his work and whether he'd ever been entangled with any priests involved in sex abuse. And it looks like that's all
yeah.
been cleared up. And so now he'll be raised to the altars at last, which I'm thrilled about.
Well,
But
this is
so
good news, because is it anything to do with the fact we have an American Pope?
I have no idea. Yeah, that goes way beyond what I know in terms of the machinations here, but I'm just
Hey,
happy to
I'm
receive it.
marking the moment. If this
Yeah.
happens, I want to, hey, I have a, personal friendship with a saint of
Hmm.
the Roman Catholic Church, which even though I am an apostate outcast, that should count for something.
Well, and so what can we ask him to help us with? What is the work for ordinary people here on Earth? And I think one thing to remember is that for a long time, any victory for the pro-life movement was gated behind the Supreme Court. That the
Yeah,
long fight to overturn Roe meant people were hyper-focused on legal appeals and often on small ways to restrict abortion providers that didn't quite make straightforward arguments.
yeah,
Can we uphold this rule about hallway widths and will that result in clinics being closed? We no longer have to beat around the bush. Like, the
mm,
job of the pro-life movement and of all ordinary pro-lifers is to convince your neighbor. Because there's really no way to win a victory here that doesn't involve putting ourselves in a position to win referenda
yeah,
straightforwardly. And so I think that's the challenge. I think there's a lot of kind of muscles and reflexes that are focused on, well, how can we get the courts to clear things up, or how will politicians serve us? And I think they could do a better job than they're doing.
yeah.
But to win a real victory, we have to change individual people's minds and have a real democratic majority. And that's the task ahead of us right now.
Yeah, and I don't think, be careful what you wish for, because I think that a lot of the anger of the MAGA movement, as I've said on this with program, but also in my commentaries, it was misunderstood by liberals, who love to focus on the GDP and the economy and the lack of jobs and the Rust Belt and so forth. I said, you have misunderstood the seething anger that started in the 60s with the sexual revolution and comes right into our own day. And what was interesting is abortion was being legalized state by state without much rancor, by Ronald Reagan in California, by Rockefeller in New York. In a way, Roe was kind of the final straw when it came to energizing not just Roman Catholics, but eventually evangelicals, and then other things as well. Um, and so essentially, the work was not done by the left to convince anybody, other than just sort of end run the whole thing by going to the court. But now I think we've got a situation which I do not know anybody on the conservative side of things, with a few rare exceptions. I think Ross Douthat would be someone who would understand what I'm saying here, who has thought through the unintended consequence of hooking your wagon to the MAGA movement, because their fury, when I see video clips of a Latino Roman Catholic woman with 3 children being dragged by her hair out of a courthouse by masked men with flak jackets on. My son served in the Marine Corps and fought in
Mm.
Afghanistan and Iraq. This is not what he was trained to do. So his DIs would scream at a Marine who thought this is what people in the uniform of the United States do. And I'm thinking, gee, did you count on this when you voted for Trump so you could get Project 2025 going and reverse all these things you don't like? I don't mean you personally. And I don't think people on the right did, any more than the left counted on the fury, this rising tide of fury that would put Trump in office. And I throw that out to you because I think your book is so thoughtful and so well represented in terms of the point of view you articulate, that I'm just curious about how you think about this situation, because we're in it right now.
Yeah, I really want my book to be something that lets people feel like they can start a conversation with a
Yeah,
member of their family or a friend where they're on opposite sides of a big issue like abortion and they have
yeah,
a place to start it from common ground. Because again, I think it's really obvious, right now, but it's always been true. You can't rely on a politician to speak to the heart of someone else in your life. That's your responsibility.
Yeah.
And we can ask more of our politicians, and we should, but there is some amount of work that can only fall to us individually, and I want to empower people to take it on.
Yeah, and I think and just give me any experiences of that you've had, say, in podcasts or interviews on this book. I saw the one with Ross, but I know you must be doing other things. How's it being received? Is anybody giving it a fair review who might approach this from another side? I'd love to see what the New Yorker says about it if they would touch it. I mean, so far, when did the book come out?
It came out in October, and I can mention kind of three reviews that meant a lot to me. One from just an ordinary reader who gave the book 4 stars on Goodreads and says, "This is the book I've agreed with and disagreed the most
Mm,
with of any book
mm,
I've read."
mm.
And it meant so much to me that a reader coming from that experience of the book would give it 4 stars, right? To think
Yeah,
that this book didn't totally work for them. It wasn't preaching to the choir. It had things they disagreed with, and they felt it was worth sitting with. That's my goal. And in some ways, I got a parallel review in The Atlantic from Anna Louise Sussman, who's definitely not in agreement with me on a lot of the issues close to my heart, but really
sure.
wanted to sit and wrestle with it and think, why do we agree here and disagree here? What's
Yeah.
driving this? And it was a really curious review, which is all I ask for from a reader. And even one of the more aggressively negative reviews from Becca Rothfield at the Washington Post, one thing I appreciate is she put forward pretty clearly what drove her disagreement, and that allows the reader to think, okay, well, which of these arguments am I more sympathetic
Yeah.
to? Because she felt my book sets back women, and she said pretty bluntly that anything that is premised on there being real biological differences between men and women that matter is bad for women. She even goes so far as to say, like, why does Leah keep treating pregnancy as though it's a distinct human experience as opposed to
Yeah.
just anything else that could be uncomfortable? And, I obviously disagree with Becca. She disagrees with me, but she did the compliment of making her objections plain enough that I think a lot of Washington Post readers who may or may not pick up the whole book will still read that and go, but pregnancy is different,
Yeah.
Some of these things matter. So if I'm not fully in agree with Becca's critique, do I have any room to agree with Leo or try and forge some new synthesis of my own? So I really appreciate, that kind of skeptical but plain spoken engagement from all ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and the thing is, my perspectives is a little different at this point, and that is I think the way I put it is a culture can only be deconstructed once, and then after that you're just watching the rubble bounce. And I was listening to Mozart's Requiem after I finished reading your book and before my wife Jeannie got back from her yoga class. And by the way, I cooked her lunch too because I like to
Mhm.
cook, so we were
Mhm.
on the same page. But I was thinking if two lines were forming and Leah's in one line with her book, some of which I disagree with, and Mozart's Requiem was playing, and the other line is all my, secular liberal friends with their well-crafted excuses for, why whatever it might be, sex differences don't exist, or pregnancy is just another thing, or, being a woman is, I would definitely be in your line. And I'm not talking about theologically, but my sensibility in my book, The Gospel of Zip, and your sensibility about caring being the built-in thing that makes us human. Um, the way I put it is it's all about the survival of the friendliest, not the most competitive, or you and I wouldn't be talking here.
Mhm.
Someone cared somewhere in a way that they sacrificed for your ancestors, or you wouldn't be here. Me neither. And so I really love that overarching thread of care that runs through your book. Speaking of this, you write some differences between men and women can be bridged. Men are on average taller than women, but it's possible to find both men and women who stand 5'7" tall without too much trouble. Of course, they'll feel very differently about how their equal height changes how they encounter the world. But the potential to bear a child is an absolute difference. Even men and women who both suffer from infertility experience very different privations. A man misses the chance to engender a child, but the woman has an additional grief, the absence of the child she knows intimately as it squirms inside her belly. And of course, you're writing as a woman who's had miscarriages, so you know what you speak. A feminism that fears acknowledging difference will be unable to advocate fully for women or children. For a woman, quote, too vulnerable and too close, end quote, doesn't end when she slides out from behind the driver's wheel. Women's bodies are more permeable to another's need. Our lives are shaped by the potential for someone to depend on us and only on us in their most vulnerable time of life. And, I really think that sums up what you're saying, but it also to me rings completely true. And so, you have to be ignoring something like that simply for a political end, because and that's why, by the way, I mentioned Kat Bohannon's Eve, because she would totally disagree with you on your view of abortion, but her book basically backs up everything you're saying in terms of what, women evolved. I mean, it's a big, thick book about how women evolved. So in terms of that passage, is that the kind of thing that critics who would disagree with your point of view as being, quote, too conservative or Roman Catholic would cite? Is that the sort of thing we're talking about? What would anybody disagree with?
I think there's that hope that maybe these moments where women's differences are more stark can be framed as just this brief passing period.
Yeah,
Maybe while you're pregnant, this is true, but that's why you should be allowed to stop being pregnant by whatever means necessary. And
yeah,
for when it's a wanted pregnancy, you graduate from this very quickly. So it's 9 months of interruption from your real life, and then
yeah,
you're restored to full human personhood afterwards.
yeah.
And I think that is the view a lot of people hold or hope it's possible to hold. In my case is really, that this isn't an option for anyone. That
Mm,
whether you ever have a baby, whether you're a woman or not, you're going to get caught out as not autonomous in the way people envision.
yeah,
And if you start from the assumption of those periods of greater dependence of non-autonomy are an interruption of your real life, then of course you'll wind up, profoundly resenting them. That it's your
mm,
real life, your identity being put on pause versus this is what it means to be a human person. So the
mm,
bad news is this is coming for you either way. The
yeah.
good news is your fundamental human dignity isn't compromised.
Yeah, no, I really like that. Let me just get to one thing that was interesting. You say in your book about tooth veneers and this whole kind of performative aspect of our culture. I did a whole commentary. It has to be said because I was so annoyed by a review of White Lotus. I guess it was episode, not episode, but the third season of it, that Mike White made. And I knew Mike when he was a kid, but that's not why I reacted. But they were zeroing in on Saturday Night Live did a skit mocking the young British actress who had crooked teeth, who's part of the show, saying, why didn't she get her teeth fixed and so forth and so on. And I was reminded of a comment that was made by a friend of mine who reviewed copies of my book, Crazy for not Crazy for God, but my The Gospel of Zip, and she gave me some notes on it. And she's a feminist and she writes for the New York Times and all this kind of thing. But she was saying basically we're having a sort of a broad discussion about all these issues of teeth veneers and lip fillers and all the rest of it. And she sort of said, well, any women's movement that has the Kardashians as a role model, basically, it proves the fact that feminism is dead. And she's, is kind of a feminist, but this sort of performative stuff. So I was interested that you took a little lighter detour in your book that's very serious to talk about irreversible tooth veneers, but you use that as a metaphor or as an example of something deeper in terms of things that we do that can't be changed because you can't go back after that. What was the example you were trying to make with that?
I think part of it is that when we have kind of a horror of the natural, that the fixes we have may not be reversible when we come to regret them.
Yeah,
That when it comes to tooth veneers in particular, you actually have to grind off the enamel so you have space to put the veneers on. There's
sure.
no
Yeah,
ability to go back. You've removed what you had. And I think there's a lot of ways we strike at real gifts of our biology because we're not sure how to make space for them or to find them beautiful, and then
yeah,
find that we've broken things beyond repair.
yeah. You say when human beings and human bodies are expected to exist in isolation, speaking of bodies, women and men are asked to prune the connections that tie us to others. Of course, this is a more serious point. What makes us most human, the dependence in which we all begin our lives, is viewed as strange and a passing and passing a problem to get over. But of course, I think that extends to the way we view life as we live it. It's not just that being pregnant sort of is this thing you do and then you get over it and you become human again. I find that kind of utilitarian approach to everything. Um, the way I would sum it up is a wider issue, and that is I think we've lost the ability to understand the intrinsic worth of everything that we are. And so I see that, for instance, in the time that I try to take getting to know the women who work at Market Basket where I go shopping. And I've been to the same store now for the last 40 years and seen a lot of their arc of their career. I can pick up conversations. How was your niece's wedding? Because I always, when I go shopping, unless I can't, you know, there's an added 20 minutes to half an hour of time because I know the people stocking the yogurt shelf. And I'm saying, oh, you're not wearing gloves today. Your hands must be cold. But I also know that her niece got married. And how did that go? That's not pregnancy, but it would be considered an unimportant moment, that you breeze by because now I have to get back here to do this podcast or something, quote unquote, important because this is what I do. I really object to that. And I don't see life divided into important and then sort of in between things like time you lose in a waiting for luggage to come out of an airplane, as opposed to the real stuff you're doing. And I think that's the way you look at this whole idea of pregnancy and children is sort of something you get through to get back to the main theme, which of course is about making money, position, career, prestige, titles. Um, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but do you see a connection there too? This sort of idea of the intrinsic worth of things, including the beauty of human experience, is what it's all about anyway. And if you lose that, you've lost everything.
Yes, I think the more that we narrow our sense of what the good life consists of, the more a lot of ordinary parts of human life are viewed as an interruption of that pursuit of the good
Yeah.
life.
Yeah, and basically what is viewed as an interruption is often everything that actually mattered that day. So
That's
your
right.
kids interrupt you, so you hand them a screen because now you can get back to the important thing you're doing on your laptop. The lady at the checkout wants to chat, but you're in a hurry to get into the parking lot and leave. People live their whole lives that way, and everything is considered an interruption. I had a young man couple of months ago was telling me about this girl he had lived with and they loved each other and he's been together with 7 years, but now she's moved to San Francisco for her career and he's in New York, so that'll be the end of that relationship, as if somehow the career would dictate their ability to have a romantic connection, or perhaps marriage and children. That's a kind of a big example of what I'm talking about, but one of the things I liked about your book is the orientation toward love and connection. So talk a little bit about your husband because I found that very warm. And by the way, when you were talking with Ross Dothat, the other guest there, you kept challenging her. I think I forget your actual words, but you kept saying to her, can you say anything good about men at all? And I forget what that was, but tell me
Yeah,
about it.
there a lot of our conflict was that she had ways of talking about what were male virtues and male vices,
That's
but
it.
only had something to say about female vices, which raised the question of to be a woman in the world, is your primary job harm reduction, avoiding these particular vices,
Yeah.
or can she articulate a positive good that women should strive for? And she, neglected to do that.
Yeah, so now I want you to articulate one, and I know you've got plenty in your book, but let's talk a little bit about how you would frame this instead of
Well,
the way she was thinking of
so
it.
one of the ways that would be different for me is that I don't think of the world as kind of divvied up in that four quadrant way: male
Yeah,
vice, male virtue, female vice, mysterious, maybe not doesn't exist, female virtue.
yeah,
I think the virtues and vices as a Christian are open to everyone, that everyone is called to be courageous, to have fortitude, to have charity.
yeah,
But what you expect that to look like in your life as embodied will change whether you're a man or a woman. It will change, for some people in bigger ways than others. Joan of Arc's form of courage is very different than my form of courage. We're both
yeah,
called to be courageous, and what form that courage takes depends on what responsibilities God has placed in our life and how we choose to embrace them. So for women, a lot more of fortitude tends to look like accepting difficult things, giving an enthusiastic yes, a fiat to them,
mm,
where it would be dishonorable to avoid them. This is true for men also. My husband and I both spent most of Christmas helping our vomiting children get through a stomach bug, which was
yeah,
hard on both of us.
yeah,
Pregnancy was hard on me in a distinct way that's related to it. For men, it's more often the case that being courageous or showing fortitude requires actively moving towards an accepting of responsibility you could have avoided,
yeah,
versus women more often have the experience of having something that, because of your embodied nature, comes to you and you choose how you respond, but you can't choose whether it's going to happen to you or not.
yeah, yeah. Speaking of Joan of Arc, she got burnt, of course, for her pains. And what was interesting is if you look at the history of it, it's not that the British burned her. It was the British. It was the one thing the British and the Catholic bishops could both agree on when they were trying to restore the British crown in France after, she got caught, was that she'd be burnt. Now she's a saint. So, that's interesting to me because, um, and I know you don't argue this in your book, but obviously, just as I look at my evangelical background as a training to be a misogynist, or as I put it in my book at the beginning, basically an asshole by divine right because men are supposed to be this way. Um, the Catholic teaching on women and kind of Marian theology often has not extended to the way women are actually treated. So, people like you and I who come, I don't know whether you come from a religious background or not, whether you were brought up in the Catholic tradition or convert, how did you come to this?
So I grew up as an atheist. I became a Catholic after college, after a lot of argument. And for me, it was always began as a very intellectual process of conversion, of exploring moral philosophy and really the epistemological question of how do we come to know the good that pushed me into
Yeah.
the church.
Talk about that journey a little bit because I'm so interested in that because of my own journey. And first of all, let's just talk about the fact that these things are journeys. And sometimes people ask me, what did you mean by this that I wrote 20 years ago in a nonfiction book? And I said, I have no idea because that was then and this is now. And I'm in a different place now. By the way, that'll be your experience as time goes on too, and maybe already is with your books. But I'm just curious what that journey was because as I read your book, I was thinking I really want to dig a little bit into your journey to Catholicism or from within it or whatever. So what sort of background did you have? Mine was evangelical missionary pastors in Switzerland who had gone over in 1947 after the war to work with young people. And then my dad became this superstar within the evangelical community, and I became his nepotistic sidekick. And then I fled the whole thing and quit. That's my background. And I describe myself as an atheist who prays. So I don't have any certainty. It's different than agnosticism. That's a philosophical position. Mine is much more just accepting the paradox of who I am and how I was raised, conflicting with what I, sometimes think is true or not true. So what's your journey?
Yeah, so in the time we have, I won't be able to give a full or satisfying answer, but I
Take
talk
as
about it
long as you
more.
want because I'm really interested.
Well, I talk about it more in my book, Arriving at Amen, but I grew up as an atheist on Long Island. I don't think I've really talked to real Christians in person about their Christianity till I went to college and would join the Yale Political Debating Society and spent
Hmm.
my Tuesdays and Thursdays having fights with the smartest wrong people I could find. And really, for me, again, that animating question was, we have some orientation towards the good in the same way we have an eye that's oriented towards vision. We have a conscience that's oriented towards the good, though it's not 100% reliable, just like our eyes can deceive us. The
Yeah.
question was for me, even as an atheist, by what standard do we measure whether our conscience corresponds to some real thing in the same way we want to check that what we see corresponds to what's actually there? And how does this all work anyway? It's kind
Mm.
of positing some level of non-material access to reality. And the more I dug into this question and the more I came to understand Catholic teaching, it felt like I didn't think Catholicism was true, but I thought it was coherent in the
Mm.
way that a really well-written fantasy series, you feel like the world holds together, even though it
Yeah.
isn't real. But then ultimately pushing harder and harder on that question of how do we come to know the good tipped me all the way over from atheism into theism. And there was Catholicism coherent and ready-made to catch me.
Yeah. That's a good story. Now, which book of yours is that about? Because I want to read that.
That's arriving at amen.
Arriving at Amen. I will definitely read that. Maybe we'll have you back to talk about it
Maybe.
if you do discussions that aren't about, what's new.
Hmm.
Have you ever read a book called Morally Believing Animals by the sociology professor at Notre Dame that published your book?
No, I don't think I have.
It's one of my favorite books, and it's also one of our friend Catherine Packalook's favorite books. And she quotes it quite often. It's a short little book. If you want to read a really good book
Hmm.
that will affirm what you have come to and made me question whether I would ever travel in that direction, put it that way, it would be that book, Morally Believing Animals. I think it's a terrific book. It's a small
Thank
book,
you.
but it sort of talks about what you just talked about. Um, anyway, so let me get back to your book and away from that one. Uh, you talk about the indignities and inconveniences women encounter can be a matter of minor friction or deadly flaws. As a woman, I take medicines calibrated to men's metabolism. So there you sort of get into the daily misogyny that we're faced just by a culture that is structured this way. And of course, that culture comes out of the kind of traditional religion which you now go back to. So, how do you reconcile that? I don't mean, how do you reconcile that to being a Roman Catholic, but how do you reconcile, sort of similar to my question before about Trump and Musk and all these people? How do you reconcile what I'll call the broad misogyny of a bad kind? I'm not talking about, people being called misogynists who aren't because they happen to believe in traditional marriage or something. Um, it just seems to me that a lot of the movement that has now coalesced around, uh, conservative politics, if you look at the religious history of those movements, they're not particularly good on the issue you're good on. Um,
Well, I think,
so,
yeah, I think one thing that's important to notice, especially with that example of drug trials and women's exclusion, is that not every bad outcome requires a lot of animus to get there, right?
right.
That what you see there is kind of a lack of curiosity, and it's a motivated lack of curiosity because it would cost a lot of money to fully incorporate women rather than to treat them
Yeah.
as basically the same as men and get to run the whole thing with half or fewer people.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of places in which, whoever is currently making decisions can be unmotivated to be curious about the people who are excluded. And I think that's just a
Yeah.
common human flaw. And the challenge is, how do you awaken people's real curiosity and compassion to say there's a cost to excluding people
Yeah.
here?
Yeah.
And what can we do, even though the cost may feel like it's high because it's a new cost, to make salient the other hidden cost of, well, I'm taking drugs that weren't developed for me, and women have this much higher of a rate of side effects from taking medication because the medication wasn't well tested or calibrated for them.
Yeah. I have a favor to ask you. I'd like you to read something from your book if you just want to pick it up. And I'm springing this on you. You don't mind reading a bit, do you?
Is there a section you have in mind?
Yes, I have a
Mhm.
definite section on my in mind. It's from chapter 2, The Lie of the Lonely Individual. I think that's what it's called, isn't it?
Yep.
And so I wanted you to read from the start that talks about during an extreme 2023 snowstorm in
Yes, I can do
California.
that part. All right.
Okay,
And
Robert Rice, all the way
mhm,
down to where it ends saying, help to travel to and comfort his dying wife, which is the
mhm,
end of that story. Do
mhm.
you mind reading that?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. And that's probably around where we'll wrap up, keeping an eye on the clock, but let's give it a go.
Yeah, no problem. And I actually have that sort of down towards conclusion, and I thought it would give
Mhm.
people a flavor of your writing and what the book's really about.
All right. So from chapter 2, Dignity
Yeah.
of Dependence. During an extreme 2023 snowstorm in California, Robert Rice, a 79-year-old veteran, was cut off from his wife. He had been making daily trips to see Anne, who was in a skilled nursing facility and who was nearing the end of her life. But 10 feet of snow had fallen in the San Bernardino Mountains. When the major roads were finally semi-passable, he was still struggling with arthritic hands to clear a path down his driveway. After working himself to exhaustion, he told Karina Knoll of the New York Times he did something harder. He asked for help from his neighbors. Knoll's article reproduced his Facebook post. Here I quote directly from his post. I never thought I would have to do this. Here goes. My wife Anne is in a skilled nursing facility down the hill. She does not have long to go. I can't even get down to say goodbye. Is there anyone who can help with my driveway? It's about half down, but it needs to be wider so I can back my small car up. I'm an Army Vietnam veteran and retired law enforcement officer. This is very embarrassing for me to even ask for help. Sorry. I still can't read it without crying. Crueler than the storm is Mr. Rice's firm conviction he was letting others down by naming his need and asking for help. The atmospheric river that brought the snow was an extreme weather event, but it requires a sustained, bitterly cold climate to teach a faithful husband it's embarrassing to ask for help to travel to and comfort his dying wife. And I'll actually go just two more paragraphs. I also want people to know he did get help here.
Please read it.
Despite his fears, Rice's neighbors turned out in force, not resentful, but glad to be asked for help. As Noel reported, neighbors showed up with shovels and then a tractor. It took them 3 hours of work to make a passage and 2 more hours to broaden it when it initially proved too narrow for Rice's car. Eventually, he was able to back down the drive and onto the road. For much of his drive, the snow towered up on both sides, making it feel like he was slipping down a narrow canal. And that's from her article, so back to me. I hope that when Rice finally emerged into the light, unrestrained and unsheltered by the walls of snow, it felt like he was entering a new, kinder world. But I don't know if he carried his shame the whole way to his wife's hospital bed, feeling like he'd shown up as less because he hadn't been able to come alone.
Yeah, I love that story. And I just love what it does in terms of summing up why, in essence, we're all caregivers, which is what your book is about. And we should all recognize that. So, you've written a terrific book, and I know you have a heart out. Normally, I would ask you to stick around and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, about guests you would recommend and ways to stay in touch with you and help promote the book. But I'll let you go because I know you have something else to do. And then maybe Ernie can connect with you about those other things.
That sounds great. And for anyone looking for me off the podcast, I'm at otherfeminisms.com.
Yeah, and we will connect to that properly. Once you talk to Ernie, we'll get everything correct
Sounds
because we
wonderful.
want to promote what you're doing, and we really like the book. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for